The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. Though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable. Under the law of nature, we are all born free.
Of all the founding fathers of the United States, one voice rose above the others to define the principles that would create the great experiment of American democracy: Thomas Jefferson. The range and depth of Jefferson's accomplishments were so immense, they stagger the mind. Farmer, lawyer, scientist, musician, philosopher, architect, author of the Declaration of Independence, he would serve 2 terms as the 3rd President of the United States. Yet his very public achievements masked a shy, tender man who was happiest at home with a book or violin in hand. His lifelong quest for wisdom produced a man of deep complexity. Troubled, yet optimistic. Disciplined, yet generous. A radical thinker and revolutionary who shunned open debate. Thomas Jefferson preferred to let his pen make his arguments.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Through generations, Jefferson's words have inspired men and women to hope and to action.
In the Democratic Revolution in the late 80s, the Declaration of Independence was quoted from Tiananmen Square to Prague. In fact, the New York Times ran a page-1 story on a town meeting in Prague. And this is a paraphrase, but a brewery worker in grimy overalls stood up and said, "Thomas Jefferson defined our rights 200 years ago in the Declaration of Independence. It's time for the people of Czechoslovakia to claim them."
The eldest son of Peter and Jane Jefferson was born on their Virginia plantation in April of 1743. Peter owned nearly 3,000 acres of land in the Piedmont, just east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A beautiful country of rich earth, with rolling hills and clear running rivers. Although they lived on the frontiers of European America, the Jefferson family had become a part of the wealthy Virginia class of tobacco planters whose history, even at Thomas Jefferson's birth, stretched back over 100 years. Here, tobacco was everything. Bills were paid in tobacco, and civil fines were measured in pounds of tobacco. To support this society built on the export of a single crop, slaves had become the established labor force. Men, women, and children captured in Africa were brought in great numbers to the southern colonies. By the time of Jefferson's birth, Virginia possessed nearly as many slaves as freemen. Thomas Jefferson's early life in the fields and mountains of the Piedmont filled him with a poet's love for nature, as well as a scientific fascination with its wonders. He was the 3rd child in a family of 10, only 6 of whom survived to adulthood. His father was a capable man who had married well and was an early settler of Virginia's colonial frontier. His son later wrote,
My father's education had been quite neglected, but being of a strong mind, sound judgment, and eager after information, he read much and improved himself.
Of Jefferson's mother, Jane, little is known, but her daughter, Jane, Thomas's older sister, was by far his favorite sibling. Never married, young Jane Jefferson was reportedly a musician of some achievement, a singer of mellifluous voice, a lover of books, and a witty conversationalist. Undoubtedly, she helped young Thomas in his early studies, for Peter Jefferson saw to it that all his children were tutored from an early age. Young Jefferson first attended a one-room schoolhouse at Tuckahoe, the plantation home of his mother's family, the wealthy Randolphs. Outside of school, Peter taught his son to ride and shoot, but the boy's childhood was short. Peter Jefferson died of an unknown cause in 1757, leaving 14-year-old Thomas an eventual inheritance of considerable land and a largely self-sufficient plantation. As his father had wished, Jefferson continued his education.
He went to local parsons who doubled as schoolmasters, learned, of course, the Latin, and picked up a little Greek as well, Latin and Greek, and became a rather proficient classical scholar as a young man.
In addition to language and the sciences, he also studied music. Talented musicians were much in demand at Piedmont area parties.
Music was one of Jefferson's passions. As he said, the favorite passion of my soul, and it's you find it as a connecting thread throughout his life.
On one occasion, he met another violinist and future revolutionary.
Patrick Henry made a very vivid impression on young Jefferson on the way to Williamsburg into college, and Jefferson recalled that he excelled in fiddling, in pleasantry, and in dancing. Henry had an exuberant personality. Jefferson is more cool and detached. They were close friends and allies in the Revolution, but later had a very serious personal and political break.
But no matter how much he enjoyed plantation society, Jefferson put his schooling first. A friend wrote that Jefferson could tear himself away from his dearest friends to fly to his studies. At the age of 16, he successfully petitioned the executors of his father's estate for permission to attend the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. Williamsburg, at the time Virginia's capital, was a town of little more than 1,000 people. Yet to Jefferson, it seemed a metropolis. Still more important than the city or even the college were the three older men who became Jefferson's most influential friends. Together, they functioned as Jefferson's surrogate fathers.
More important, really, than the college were these three figures. They were really his faculty. A Dr. William Small, who was very scientifically minded. His law mentor was George Wythe, probably the most learned attorney in Virginia at that time. And then the third member of that Williamsburg trio, as Jefferson called it, was the governor, the royal governor, Francis Fauquier, fellow of the Royal Society, and very much interested in the arts.
Jefferson wrote of Dr. Small, his professor at William and Mary.
He fixed the destinies of my life. From his conversation, I got my first views of the expansion of science and of the system of things in which we are placed.
What Dr. Small did was introduce Jefferson to the philosophies of the Enlightenment, including the works of Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, and John Locke. It was John Locke who wrote in his second essay on government, "No one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Jefferson bought books lavishly and filled his days with reading. After his second year, he left William and Mary and began a course of self-study, directed by his second Williamsburg friend, the distinguished counselor at law, George Wythe. Jefferson had decided he would become a lawyer. To prepare, he studied 15 hours a day.
Rise at 5 a.m., read till 8 books on agriculture, botany, zoology, chemistry, anatomy, religion. 8 to 12, read law. 12 to 1, read politics. Afternoon, read history, then run a mile into the country and back for exercise. And in the evenings, read rhetoric, oratory, literature, and language.
Dr. Small clearly approved of Jefferson and saw to it that he was invited to the palace of Governor Fauquier. Jefferson became a frequent dinner guest, even playing his violin in weekly concerts. At the governor's table, politics, philosophy, and art were all familiar subjects. It was impressive company for the 19-year-old boy from the Piedmont. If over time he became accepted and at ease in the company of professors and governors, there remained one group in whose presence the tall redhead was still uncomfortable: women. One biographer reported that in the flyleaf of a book he wrote,
Jane Nelson is a sweet girl. Betsy Page is a neat girl. Rebecca Burrell is the devil. If not the devil, she's one of his imps.
Infatuated with Rebecca, he plagued his friends for news of her, indulged in fantasies of marriage, yet could never bring himself to reveal his feelings in person. With women, young Jefferson was painfully, agonizingly shy. The result was perhaps inevitable. Rebecca married another man. To cover his frustration, Jefferson threw himself into his law studies under George Wythe.
As we think about the influence on Jefferson's politics and especially his political philosophy, I think the Williamsburg experience is very important. Jefferson was trained to be a lawyer, and even though he gave up the practice, he's a lifelong advocate. He could make a case, he could make an argument. I think part of that Williamsburg experience placed Jefferson at the crucible of the big issues of his time in the 1760s as men of learning and men of practical affairs were discussing the relationship with the mother country and the relationship between government and society. So Jefferson is there in the laboratory of ideas.
Admitted to the bar at 24, Jefferson established a practice, and his reputation as a fair and compassionate lawyer began to grow. It was at this time that Jefferson began to draw the rough plans for a home, a dream house he would build for himself. He picked an unusual mountaintop site, one he remembered from childhood for its exquisite view of the surrounding landscape, a place of serenity and meditation. He gave his home a name, Monticello, meaning Little Mountain. Like all projects close to Jefferson's heart, its construction, refinement, and expansion would occupy him for most of his life.
Monticello was an almost 4-decade-long experiment. It was a hobby, in a way, for Jefferson. He was able to remake the building several times over, so that the Monticello you see today is not the Monticello that he first built.
In 1769, his fellow landowners in Albemarle County voted Jefferson, as they had his father, into the House of Burgesses. Along with Patrick Henry, other members included George Wythe and a gentleman farmer from Fairfax County, George Washington. Jefferson aligned himself with those members who were vocal in their resistance to control by the British Parliament. But his first proposed legislation concerned a more controversial subject: slavery. Jefferson, as a young and idealistic lawyer, argued that all men were born free in nature. Yet slave labor fueled the economic engine of Virginia's economy. Though there was little hope of abolishing it outright, he hoped to at least help to reduce the numbers held in bondage. His first bill sought to give slave owners a limited right to free individual slaves. But when a respected senior member put forth Jefferson's bill, he was shouted down by the other Burgesses and denounced as an enemy of his country.
Jefferson, throughout until the end of his life, continued to be a firm advocate of gradual emancipation. He was the author of a plan of gradual emancipation, time of the American Revolution in Virginia, which would have freed all slaves when they became adults as of a particular year.
There are some who argue that Jefferson did not include Negro slaves as part of common humanity. Yet he never qualified his belief that all men are created equal.
He said that the slave trade was a war on human nature itself. It's quite clear that his whole conception of slavery was a different race, but it's all part of the same species, and it's all part of one mankind.
By the middle of 1770, the first small room of Monticello was completed, and Jefferson moved in, alone, filling shelves with his ever-growing collection of books. At 27, he was still a bachelor, but before the year was out, he had begun to court Martha Wales Skelton, widow of a former college acquaintance. 22-year-old Martha was bright and well-read. Her contemporaries describe her in glowing terms. Martha had large, lively hazel eyes, a brilliant complexion, and exquisite figure, but looked very short standing next to the 6'2" and 1/2" Jefferson. She played the harpsichord with accomplishment and had studied music with the same old Italian master with whom Jefferson had studied violin. Out came the violin, and he and Martha played and sang music together. Legend has it that while Thomas and Martha were singing a duet at her father's house, 2 other suitors arrived to wait in an adjoining room. After listening to the strains of a love song, both men were so convinced of the young couple's sincerity that they left and pressed their suits elsewhere. Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales Skelton were married on New Year's Day, 1772. Thomas took his new bride to his as yet unfinished mountaintop home, Monticello. The next 15 months were to prove some of the happiest days of Jefferson's life. After 10 months, a baby girl was born and named as Jefferson's parents had done after her mother. Gazing out on the tranquil hills of the Piedmont, Thomas Jefferson may well have thought that the course of his life was now set, comfortable and predictable as his father's before him. Then in the spring, their security was shaken by the death of Jefferson's brother-in-law. Barely a month later, Martha's father, John Wales, also died. Death from illness was common, swift, and unpredictable in colonial Virginia. The limited medical knowledge of the time meant that precise causes of death were often misunderstood or left unrecorded. Thomas and Martha offered to take Jefferson's widowed sister's family into their home. From her father, Martha inherited slaves, land, and considerable debt. A number of the slave children were allegedly fathered by John Wales, and thus may have been Martha's half-brothers and sisters. The new responsibilities Jefferson was beginning to take on in his home would soon be echoed by crucial political responsibilities from the world beyond Monticello. Jefferson was in attendance at the House of Burgesses when the Southern colonies received news of the Boston Tea Party and the British retaliation, closing the port of Boston. The legislature expressed their enthusiastic support for the rebellious Bostonians. Incensed, the royal governor of Virginia summarily dissolved the House of Burgesses. Undeterred, the members put forth a call to the other colonies for a meeting in Philadelphia of a Continental Congress to act on their own mounting grievances with the king. Jefferson drafted for the Virginia delegation a set of proposed resolutions on the rights of the colonies. Though admired, they were considered too radical by the majority. This was a Congress of men who still believed they could chart a middle ground. Said George Washington, "I am well satisfied that no such thing as independence is desired by any thinking man in all North America." It was fall, 1774. Events were running ahead of cool heads. Pamphlets, including printed versions of Jefferson's resolutions, were widely circulated. Militias of self-defense were forming in some of the colonies. In the spring, the Battle of Lexington and Concord produced the first shots of what would become a Revolutionary War. Patrick Henry proclaimed, "Give me liberty, or give me death." When the Second Continental Congress met in June of 1775, Thomas Jefferson was there. Jefferson's circle of friends had, until now, been very small. Most of his life had been spent in Williamsburg and Monticello. Here in Philadelphia, he met for the first time distinguished men of whom he had read and whose reputations he greatly admired. Here was America's most famous sage and statesman, Benjamin Franklin, relaxing in his well-worn personal chair. Here also was Massachusetts' renowned radical John Adams, a man reputed to harbor thoughts on liberty in harmony with Jefferson's. When the tall, carrot-headed young Virginian shook hands with the short, pudgy lawyer from Massachusetts, they made an odd couple.
There are many counterpoints in personality, in physical stature, in temperament. There are great differences. But the fact is, they were thrown together over a 50-year period of time. They start out as very close allies in the Revolutionary years, in the making of the nation. There was a terrible split, mainly political but also personal, at midpoint, and then a wonderful reconciliation as they both entered their sunset years.
Jefferson's first major assignment in the Continental Congress was to write a formal message to the newly enfranchised colonial army on the causes and necessity of taking up arms. It was said that when Washington read it aloud to his troops, he was greeted with rousing cheers. Henceforth, when Congress needed a public voice, their first choice was Jefferson's pen. Between sessions of Congress, he returned to Monticello. The war was growing worse, but his beautiful young wife was suffering now from chronic bouts of illness. And in the spring of 1776, his mother died at the age of 57. Jefferson wrote,
"The death of my mother happened on the last day of March after an illness of not more than an hour. we supposed it to have been apoplectic.
His wife, Martha, was another matter. It seems likely that on more than one occasion she suffered miscarriages, and pregnancy was difficult for her. But the exact nature of her frequent illnesses is unknown. It was a worried and unhappy man who returned to Philadelphia in May. Jefferson was appointed to a committee to draft a formal Declaration of Independence.
When the committee convened, they quickly, the older members, passed the buck to the youngest, who was Thomas Jefferson. He was only 33 at the time, but he did bring to Philadelphia a reputation for having a masterful pen.
Jefferson tried to argue that Adams should attempt the first draft, but he was rebuffed. Reason first, said Adams, you are a Virginian. Reason second, I am obnoxious and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can. Finally, Jefferson acquiesced. Jefferson understood that while liberty had been theorized by philosophers and politicians over the years, no declaration had ever been created to separate a people from their sovereign monarch. In proposing American independence, Jefferson later wrote,
I sought to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent.
He came forward with a draft. It was debated. Changes were made. He was like any author. Every revision was like a cut in his skin, and he winced. Dr. Franklin gave him some sage advice about keeping the big picture, and I think the bottom line is that the fundamental ideas that Jefferson had prevailed.
After the vote, the final version was read aloud before the members of Congress.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
The legacy is prodigious. Just the notion that all men were created equal in a day and age when the wealthy few ran everything, and when all men did not even have the right to vote. Then establishing the basis of government that rests upon the consent of the governed in a day and age in which governments were monarchies or tyrannically controlled.
The act was done. The road to democracy begun. During the 8-year War for Independence, Jefferson served in the newly reformed Virginia legislature, and later as governor for 2 terms. With war still raging, he sought to reform the laws that had been inherited from England. He began a 10-year battle for the separation of church and state. Although in practice Virginians were tolerant of differing doctrines, the Church of England was still supported by a general tax, and heresy was a prosecutable crime. Wrote Jefferson,
It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God.
Years later, this statement was used by political enemies to brand Jefferson as an atheist.
Jefferson called the battle to separate the church and state in Virginia one of the toughest of his entire life, and indeed it had to have been. Because church and state were synonymous, and the aristocratic class that ruled Virginia economically, socially, and politically were the established figures of the Anglican Church.
Though Jefferson kept his own beliefs private, he acknowledged a benign creator. And while skeptical of Christ as the Son of God, he had a profound belief in Christ, the moral philosopher.
For him, philosophers, more than warriors or statesmen or kings, were the real heroes of civilization.
Whenever possible, he stole away from public life to be with Martha and his 2 young daughters.
Jefferson talked about the boisterous sea of politics and how Monticello was for him the safe harbor to which he retreated. And Monticello and family were really at the center of Jefferson's life, I think. There's so many letters. We compiled many pages of quotations that use the phrase, my farm, my family, and my books. The support of his family at Monticello was so important.
In 1782, shortly before the end of the war, Martha gave birth to another baby girl. But she never fully recovered from the pregnancy. And 2 months later, frail, beautiful Martha Jefferson died at the age of 33. Distraught at her deathbed, it was said that Jefferson promised her that he would never remarry. Such was his private and personal anguish that this man who so treasured words, who saved every piece of correspondence, no matter how insignificant, apparently burned every letter he and Martha had written to each other. Only in a secret drawer in a private cabinet did he save a few mementos and a lock of her hair. The war was over, independence won, but his Martha was dead. In 1784, Jefferson went to France on diplomatic service and ultimately succeeded Benjamin Franklin as U.S. minister. Here, the still grieving man found some respite. Thomas Jefferson loved France and the French. The wealth of culture, the food, the museums, the architecture, bookshops, and gardens all delighted him, and he regained some of his former equanimity.
We think of Thomas Jefferson as being cool and analytical, and in many ways he certainly was, but he's also very human, and we can see that side of the man and his feelings about his family, but also about certain friends and certain lady friends. His wife, Martha, to whom he was totally devoted, died after they had been married only 10 years. It was a very traumatic experience. But not long afterwards, Jefferson went to France on diplomatic service and was absolutely infatuated by a remarkably talented artist and musician, Mariah Causeway. She was married, it seems not very happily, but she became Jefferson's companion. Whether there was a physical relationship, we don't know. But to me, it was like Jefferson was a teenager again and had a crush and enjoyed the company and wanted to impress Mariah Causeway. Later, he wrote to her perhaps the most self-revealing letter he ever penned. It's sometimes called the head and heart letter. And basically, Jefferson's ploy was to suggest to her a debate going on within himself between his head and his heart.
Heart, I am indeed the most wretched of all earthly beings, overwhelmed with grief. Head, I often told you that you were imprudently engaging your affections, that the lady had qualities and accomplishments such as music, modesty, beauty, and that softness of disposition which is the ornament of her sex and charm of ours, that these considerations would increase the pang of separation. Heart, yet what is more sublime delight than to mingle tears with one whom the hand of heaven hath smitten?
The joy of friendship, his letter concluded, was worth the pain of parting.
The conversation between head and heart about Mariah Causeway tells us a great deal about Jefferson, a real human being.
Longing for the refuge of Monticello, Jefferson returned from France after 5 years to find that in his absence, he had been nominated as George Washington's Secretary of State. He reluctantly accepted. But in the cabinet, Jefferson found himself at odds with the young Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Essentially, Jefferson believed that the government that governs least governs best. Hamilton, who did not share Jefferson's trust in the people, favored a stronger central government and sought to increase its responsibility and control. Their dispute was fanned by the press and preserved in the establishment of two political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, which in turn proved the beginning of America's two-party system. To Jefferson's disappointment, his old friend John Adams aligned himself with the Federalist cause. Jefferson now found his idealistic democracy splintered by partisan bickering. Weary of public debate, disappointed in love, and anguished by separation from much of his family, Thomas Jefferson returned to Monticello in 1794. After years of neglect, the plantation was in further debt. but walking once again in his gardens, Jefferson was renewed. Excited by things he had learned about agriculture and architecture in France, he made plans for the expansion of the house and revitalization of the plantation.
Jefferson came back to Monticello in 1794 after 12 years in public service to find his own lands ruined by this extractive cultivation of corn and tobacco. He established crop rotation, was planting new crops, and he sent to England for a model of the newly invented threshing machine.
To some extent, of course, politics was not what he was made for. He said he was made to be a man of science and the arts and things like that. But the world in which he lived was not constructed that way.
Jefferson was not yet to be free of public life. John Adams was running for president to succeed Washington. At the request of the Republicans, a reluctant Jefferson entered the race, though he did not actively campaign. According to the original Constitution, which made no allowances for political parties, Jefferson, by placing second, became vice president. Among many of their disagreements during Adams' administration, the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, severely restricting freedom of speech, deeply angered Jefferson and strengthened his resolve. 4 years later, Jefferson actively opposed Adams' re-election, and this time he won. In terms of negative advertising, even today's political campaigns have not surpassed that of 1800. Jefferson was attacked for his views on religion, education, democracy, and culture. "If Jefferson is elected," wrote one minister, "our churches may become temples of reason, the Bible cast into a bonfire. Our sons become the disciples of Voltaire." Another Federalist proclaimed Jefferson a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw sired by a mulatto father, raised on hoe cake, bacon, and hominy, with an occasional change of fricasseed bullfrog. Were he to be elected, the Hartford, Connecticut Courant warned, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will all be openly taught and practiced. On Wednesday morning, March 4th, 1801, a plainly dressed Thomas Jefferson left his Washington boarding house and walked to the Capitol to be inaugurated as the third President of the United States. Despite the vitriolic campaign, his inaugural speech was conciliatory.
Though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable. The minority possess their equal rights, which law must protect, and to violate those rights would be oppression. Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists.
Jefferson's first term was hugely successful and was marked by a spirit of cooperation and compromise. In office, Jefferson disdained pomp and ceremony. At the president's house, he observed little formality at the dinner table, never designating a guest of honor, and received guests in slippers or whatever he happened to have on at the time. His manner was simple and easygoing, but never rude. One tale relates how an official visitor found the president playing on the floor with his grandchildren. "If you too are a father," said Jefferson, "I need offer no apology." Thomas Jefferson, the philosophical idealist, proved pragmatic in the execution of his office. The most dramatic departure from his desire for limited federal government and low taxes was the purchase from France in 1803 of the vast Louisiana Territory. Jefferson pursued this purchase aggressively through secret negotiations, even though he felt the Constitution did not give him the power to do so. When announced, the Republican Senate ratified the agreement promptly, though the Federalist minority complained. In one stroke, Jefferson had doubled the size of the Union. It was to prove a far-sighted move and a brilliant success. Throughout his time in office, Federalist periodicals continued to excoriate Jefferson. In addition to his reputed atheism, they now began to charge sexual misconduct. "It is well known that the man whom it delighteth the people to honor for many years has kept as his concubine one of his own slaves. Her name is Sally Hemings. By this wench, our president has had several children. The African Venus is said to officiate as housekeeper at Monticello." Jefferson never publicly commented on these charges. Faced with conflicting accounts, the truth of the matter cannot be absolutely determined.
We know a great deal about the historical Sally Hemings, and she's important in that right. We don't pretend to be experts on the Sally Hemings of conjecture.
Jefferson chose to follow Washington's example in voluntarily limiting himself to 2 terms. His chosen successor, James Madison, won the election of 1808, and Jefferson retired, at last, to Monticello. Jefferson had always been generous to a fault, and his financial affairs now became a problem. Debts dogged his later life. The slavery issue had always profoundly troubled Jefferson. The only slaves he freed during his lifetime were either mulattoes who could pass for white, or highly skilled craftsmen who might find employment elsewhere. And yet the fact that none of his ideas for restricting slavery were adopted in his lifetime worried him. He wrote,
"Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free."
And at another time,
"I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and that his justice cannot sleep forever."
Jefferson was the last of the signers of the Declaration of Independence to serve as president. Many of the original rebels of 1776 had been lost with the years. Some, like Franklin and Washington, had died. Others had split over the Republican-Federalist debates. Former friends, Adams and Jefferson, had not spoken for 11 years. The old wounds of rivalry had been slow to heal. But after repeated urgings from a mutual friend, Adams wrote a letter to his old fellow patriot on New Year's Day, 1812. A few weeks later, he received Jefferson's reply.
"A letter from you carries me back to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to man, laboring always at the same oar, with some wave ever ahead threatening to overwhelm us. And yet we rode through the storm with heart and hand and made a happy port."
Adams wrote again, and again received a reply, and the communication continued. The result was a profound and heartfelt correspondence, a chain of letters filled with thoughts and reminiscences. Over a period of 14 years, the 2 old patriots shared their deepest feelings on politics, history, philosophy, and religion. Declining health and the inevitable frailty of advancing age were slowly catching up with Jefferson, who was now in his late 70s. He still rode his horse daily, but other exercise was limited, and writing letters had become more difficult with the years. But it was during this time Jefferson began his last and most cherished public project, the establishment of the University of Virginia, the cornerstone of which was laid in 1817. Jefferson personally designed the buildings, supervised their construction, gathered the faculty, planned the curriculum, and even selected reading lists for some of the courses.
He worked at it for a period of 10, 12 years, last 10 or 12 years of his life. And originally it wasn't just to establish a university, of course. It was to revive this comprehensive plan of public education.
No democracy could survive, Jefferson reasoned, unless the electorate were fully educated and informed. At the University of Virginia, Jefferson's radical experiment in education endures to this day as a model of intellectual inquiry and architecture.
Thomas Jefferson was a gentleman architect in the English sense of the word. There were no architects that were trained in America in his day. He designed the university very fast, very quickly. One half of it he designed in 2 weeks. He created a way of seeing classical architecture that was truly American. It was a very easy way of looking at the classical world and not as stiff, not as formal as the European examples might be. His amateur status turned into genius in this country.
In 1826, Jefferson, now 83, was invited to be the honored guest at a national celebration of the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration, which was to take place on July 4th in Washington, D.C. His health deteriorating, he knew he would be unable to attend. Instead, Jefferson sent a valedictory message.
May our declaration be to the world what I believe it will be, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government.
As his words were distributed at the celebration, Jefferson lay on his deathbed. Ill for several weeks, he had hung tenaciously to life, waiting for this cherished day. At nearly an hour past noon, Thomas Jefferson slipped quietly away. A few hundred miles north, a similar drama played out in Massachusetts. Unaware that Jefferson had died, 90-year-old John Adams uttered his dying words. Thomas Jefferson still survives. In an extraordinary coincidence of fate, Adams and Jefferson died 50 years to the day from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. On his tombstone, Jefferson directed that the following be inscribed. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. In the end, the shy young man from Virginia's backwoods had become one of the great thinkers of his age. Jefferson's ideals of civic and religious freedom, of public administration and education, have become the standard by which men and women around the world judge their governments.
The words do carry not only meaning, they carry action, and they've proven that in history. These words have moved men and women through the generations. I don't think there's any question in the world about the fundamental consistency of Jefferson's life and belief, and that stayed with him to the very end. He continued to believe, despite the setbacks, that freedom was on advance and would continue to advance. It could not be turned back.
And the words first written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776 still echo through the corridors of time.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,